This is Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston, bringing you stories of capitalism. Americans are complaining about high food prices, and that's after all those federal subsidies for farmers. We go to New Zealand to look at supporting farmers a different way. Plus, Elon Musk has been promising us robotaxis for years now. Is 2026 truly going to be the year they arrive? What will they look like, and how will they make money? And climbing the highest peak in the world for fun and for profit. We bring you the story of the business of Mount Everest. But we begin with the dramatic developments in Venezuela last weekend, when the United States sent its military in to seize President Maduro and his wife, transporting them to New York to stand trial on criminal charges. Richard Haas has spent his career in and out of government advising on foreign policy. He is senior counselor at Centerview Partners, president emeritus of the Council on Foreign Relations, and author of the Substack newsletter, Home and Away.
When there's so much uncertainty, it's helpful to know where you're headed. What is the goal of the United States government right now, as far as you can discern it?
It is not regime change. It is not democracy or human rights. I think the goal of the United States, at a minimum, is access for American companies, American oil companies, to Venezuela's oil sector, which is large, but not quite as large as the statistics lead people to believe. Yes, you've got 17, 18% of the world's supply, but a lot of it's hard to get to. A lot of it's not the greatest quality crude. It's in terrible disrepair. But anyhow, I think that's priority number one. Whether there are other priorities, for example, to stop Venezuelan support of Cuba, even though as much or more comes from Mexico, but there's that. Whether to wean Venezuela from Russia, China, and others, obviously to keep them out of the drug trade. So I think there may be secondary or subsidiary objectives, but the principal objective, and the president talked about it, 15, 20 times at the Saturday press conference last week, was the oil access.
When you were in the State Department with Secretary Powell, you were head of, as you say, policy planning, not policy prediction. So it's hard to predict what's going to happen, but in order to plan, you have to think about a range. What's the range of possibilities right now in Venezuela? What's the best it can be? What's the worst it can be?
The best it could be is what we just described actually holds. That you have a situation there where you have more continuity than change, and the United States does not have to get more involved, more intrusive with boots on the ground or anything like that. There's not massive violence. And we develop a growing economic relationship. The bad news with that is you obviously don't have democracy, or particularly human rights. The average Venezuelan person might be slightly better off, but it's much more continuity than change. The bad scenarios are things unravel. Essentially, conditions of instability. It may not be as, you had chaos in Iraq within a year. So I'm not predicting chaos, but you asked me for the menu. At the other end of the menu is a real breakdown of order, that rival groups essentially start to slug it out.
Now we hear, it's a little unclear, the United States is sort of going to take some of the oil, a fair amount of the oil, sell it, put it into an account, and then maybe give some back to the Venezuelans, sort of like an allowance. How is that going to work?
Well, I think one of the interesting parts of that, because I've read the same stuff, is how do you put it, what's the sharing arrangement, David? How rich is this allowance? And this is exactly the sort of thing at some point. Nationalism hasn't disappeared in the world. Nationalism's a really powerful force. So at some point, the people challenged the Venezuelan government saying, hey, why are we giving this generous or sweetheart deal to the Americans? Why are we not keeping this here? That's exactly the dynamic, by the way, that decades ago led to all the nationalizations, not just in Venezuela, but around the world. Deals with outsiders, with the international oil companies, were seen as way too generous to them, and countries basically said, hey, this is our sovereign wealth. Why are we giving so much of it away? So the idea that argument would not surface sooner rather than later, I kind of think it will.
What are the likely consequences beyond Venezuela? Start with Latin America, for example. Certainly Colombia's come to people on the president's mind, as well as Cuba, maybe Mexico.
All of the above, and there's Canada and others, and then we get a little bit farther afield to Greenland. I think Cuba is probably the one that most worried because it's not doing well. It's not a failed state only because of external support, so they're going to have to probably find some substitutes. They've got Mexico. I don't know what Russia would be prepared to do. So I think they're probably the most nervous. The president has attacked the president of Colombia, which is too bad in some ways, because Colombia was one of the great success stories of American foreign policy. People often criticize versions of nation building. Well, we kind of got inside Colombia, and it wasn't a change of regime, but with the existing regime, we helped them deal with their civil war. We helped them deal with the drug issues. Mexico is a funny issue because it's not where the government is part of the problem, except they're indirectly part of it because they're either unable or unwilling or both to deal with the cartels. They're not meeting their sovereign obligation to make sure that their territory isn't used as a drug production and trafficking thing. So the question there is what might at some point we do about it. There's been periodic threats that we would use military force against the cartels. I think Canada is more just a scratchy relationship. I don't sense any enthusiasm, shall we say, for it to become a 51st state. Ironically enough, Venezuela is slightly closer to becoming the 51st state right now in a de facto way than is Canada. And I think the other big question mark is Greenland, farther afield geographically. But there's been so many pronouncements by the administration, both from a strategic argument as well as from a resources argument, that I actually take this seriously as a possibility. Though what's baffling to me, and here I am, an old-fashioned diplomat, if the United States wanted a more intimate strategic and economic relationship with Greenland, I think it's there for the offing. That's why God invented diplomats. You send somebody there, you negotiate the terms of it, you make it generous to them because it's important that. How it's been allowed to come to this, I truly don't understand, David.
Greenland is another territory, not country, but territory in its own right. It is under the protection of Denmark.
Yes, sir.
The sovereignty is with Denmark. You said to me when the national security strategy first came out, wow, look at this because of the Monroe Doctrine. Venezuela, Colombia, Cuba, even Canada, you could say that's Western Hemisphere.
Right.
Greenland's not, last time I checked. And it is theoretically subject to NATO protections.
100%. So you're right. It's kind of, what it reflects is not the Western Hemisphere focus of this administration, which Venezuela can be explained by. It's more the commercial and economic focus of this administration. And that's where I think it makes sense. And this administration essentially sees foreign policy more in terms of homeland security and economic welfare. So they're worried about drugs, they're worried about immigration, and they're into the business of promoting business. And I think Greenland falls a little bit into all that, but it also shows something else. A lack of concern, I don't have a word for it, David, for Europe. I mean, the two great theaters of history for the last 100+ years are Europe and Asia. And this is an administration that's dialing a lot of its attention towards this part of the world. If you connect the dots, it looks like we're moving towards a world what you might call of spheres of influence, where the United States is preoccupied here, Russia and Europe literally slug it out in their part of the world. We'll see China has something of a free hand in its part of the world. And we've gone voluntarily, which is the strangest part of this to me, as someone who studies history, from being a truly global power to being something more of a regional power.
The United States is pulling back from Europe, as you put it, at a time when Europe could be seen as being under contest from Russia, given what's going on in Ukraine. President Putin must be watching this. What does the Venezuelan development say to President Putin?
Yeah, whatever narrow setback he's experienced in Venezuela because of the Russian connection, whatever humiliation he might feel there, I think is offset. He's got to like the larger thing here. He's got to like the fact that we're demonstrating that great powers have the right to act with a pretty free hand against leaders they believe are illegitimate. He listens to that and he goes, where have I heard that before? He's got to like the fact that this separates us even more from the Europeans. He's got to like the fact that the United States is more preoccupied with the Western Hemisphere. So I think for Vladimir Putin, this is all good. One of the implications, by the way, since you raised it, David, this has, though, for this negotiation about Ukraine, the war, ending the war, which I think the chances of which are remote, I think they've become more remote. Just think about it. If you're President Zelensky, American security assurances in the current context, hard to imagine you would place your country's fate in America's word that we would be there for them. I think you're going to want a lot more than that if you're President Zelensky, and whatever he's going to require is going to be way too much for Vladimir Putin to accept. So I'm afraid, we're about to mark the end of 4 years of this phase of the war. my unhappy prediction is we're about to go well into year 5.
Up next, bailing out America's farmers. Why are we looking at another round of subsidies? And is there a better way? This is a story about thinking the unthinkable. Last month, President Trump proposed another $12 billion in federal aid for farmers hit hard by low crop prices and by the fallout of his trade policies.
I'm delighted to announce this afternoon that the United States will be taking a small portion of the hundreds of billions of dollars we receive in tariffs, and we're going to be giving and providing it to the farmers in economic assistance.
It's become almost impossible to think of U.S. farming without government payments supporting it. And the U.S. is far from the only country that intervenes in agricultural markets. But it turns out that there is one country, New Zealand, that has gone a very different way with some unexpected results.
The government wiped those subsidies in 1 year, and the net result of that has been staggering.
America started down its path to paying its farmers back in 1933, in the midst of the Great Depression, when President Roosevelt announced the Agriculture Adjustment Act.
With the whole world in turmoil, even the united efforts of the farmers themselves would not have been sufficient without the cooperation of the government of the United States.
In a recent report covering 54 countries, the OECD found that, quote, agriculture support policies generated on average $842 billion per year in transfers towards agriculture between 2022 and 2024. Dan Glickman was Secretary of Agriculture during the Clinton administration.
Well, first of all, there's a huge amount of agriculture subsidies in the United States. I mean, it's billions and billions of dollars. I think that first of all, farm programs are complicated, and nobody understands them except people in farm countries. So, you know, you have people who have to deal with them all the time, are largely the only ones that have been involved in the writing of them. But look, farming is a precarious, tough business. These people have to deal with drought, disease, floods, tariffs, geopolitical issues. To a soybean grower, China was kind of the salvation. We were exporting, you know, millions and millions of tons of soybeans to China. And when the president announced his tariffs, they were kind of off again, on again, but the impact of that was for the Chinese to kind of cut us off and go to Brazil and Argentina, and it just created a lost market for America, and it was hard to make that up. And that instability that occurred as a result of that meant that a lot of grain elevators were full and the grain couldn't be sold, or the uncertainty of production in the next year or two. So it was really, you talk about a dagger in the heart of American agriculture.
Yet across America and around the world, businesses in all sectors are forced to adapt to changing macroeconomic conditions without the promise of government assistance should things go south. What makes farming different? In the Depression era, national food security was critical, but America now produces far more food than it consumes.
There was a time that we thought that free markets helped discipline conduct in all sorts of places. Is there a risk with farm subsidies of basically becoming less efficient in farming?
That is a very good question. There's no question that farm subsidies kind of skew the economics, the market economics of agriculture. After all, if we're supporting a crop with government subsidies, then no longer is the market alone determining the price or the location or what you produce. And that is a problem. And also it skews the differences between the commodities. You may be supporting corn more than soybeans, or wheat more than corn, or those kinds of things. And so that does create inefficiencies within the marketplace. On the other hand, we will probably never get rid of farm subsidies.
But what if America, or any country around the world, did get rid of farm subsidies? It turns out that there is one such country. In the early 1980s, New Zealand's economy was in trouble. Its main export market, Great Britain, had just joined what would later be called the European Union, and public spending was at an unsustainable level.
We were within months of being bankrupt.
Lockwood Smith is a farmer himself and a former agriculture minister in New Zealand. In 1984, he'd just been elected to Parliament for the first time.
By the early 1980s, the level of support across our three main livestock industries, if you like, dairy, beef production and sheep meat or lamb, the average sort of producer subsidy equivalent across all those industries got up to 30%. But it differed among the industries. For beef and dairy, it was only about 13%, less than 20. But for lamb, the producer subsidy equivalent got up to 90%. Basically, 90% of the revenue coming into sheep farmers' pockets was from subsidies of various kinds. And of course, they responded to that because they got more subsidy if they had more sheep. And our sheep numbers climbed progressively up to 70 million. By 1984, we had 70 million sheep. And we couldn't export all the product of those 70 million sheep. We ended up turning thousands of frozen sheep carcasses into fertilizer because we couldn't, we didn't have the markets to export that stuff. And so the economy was in crisis, saw the writing on the wall. I mean, we were within months of bankruptcy, if you like. And in 1985, they decided action had to be taken and they abolished. In 1 year, they abolished all those subsidies. They wiped many of the tariffs protecting other industries. They abolished all of the subsidies for agriculture, wiped them in 1 year. I wouldn't recommend that anyone else should try to do that, but that's what happened here.
The immediate aftermath was tough, and some farms went out of business.
Probably the biggest protests I've ever seen on the front steps of the New Zealand Parliament were that year in 1985. I remember the newspaper headlines, the roar from the hills as farmers, gathered on the steps of Parliament and all the surrounding streets protesting against the removal of those subsidies.
Peter Jex Blake is a retired farmer on New Zealand's east coast. He's since handed his farm off to his daughter, but remembers it all too well.
Yeah, I remember I was a part of a protest group that the Prime Minister David Lange, a few of his ministers arrived at Gisborne Airport one day and a whole of us went out there with placards and started banging on his car windscreen because he wasn't having a bar of talking to us, so we went to every intersection that he was stopping and waving our placards and saying, holding up our bank statements showing, 18-20% interest rates is impossible. He said, change banks. I mean, they had no sympathy at all for farmers.
I was probably too young. Through the 80s, I was only a baby. So, no, I couldn't remember any of the hard times, but I always remember, even right through, Mum and Dad always trying to save money in every way and never overspend.
The immediate aftermath was tough. Although farmers did agree that there was a need for subsidy reform, they felt it was too swift and that they were unfairly targeted.
What happened was they sort of took the subsidies off before they did any other economic reform. So farmers wore the brunt of it for a few years. Basically, your income halved, land prices halved, interest rates went through the roof, inflation was trucking along 15-16%. So because none of the other parts of the economy had been reformed, pretty tough going. Fertiliser use dropped in half. So basically just toughed it out. Everybody of my generation were living on a smell of an oily rag. Yeah, it took from 1984, which is when the really hit the fan, it was 10 years really of not making much progress at all. You just you're able to gradually do some improvements, but things didn't really turn the corner until the mid-1990s.
But things did eventually turn a corner.
The result has been quite stunning, actually. It was hard initially, but the improvement in productivity since then has been stunning. Because you either changed what you're doing, or you did lose your farm, you went out of business. And so, they started introducing new genetics into our sheep flock, because it was the sheep industry was affected the most because it had the highest level of subsidies. They brought in new breeds of sheep like Finnish landrace and a breed developed in New Zealand Perindales to improve the fecundity or the number of lambs that a ewe had from being just one lamb to 2 and more. Today we have more than about 150% lambing percentages compared with less than 100% back then. They introduced new terminal sires to improve the growth rate of the lambs being born in the flock. They improved our pasture management practices so we got better utilisation of our pastures, because in New Zealand here, of course, all our livestock farming is conducted outside, just out in the natural environment, just grazing pasture. And the net result of that has been staggering. Today, our sheep numbers have come down from 70 million in 1984 to less than 26 million today. Yet the amount of lamb or sheep meat that we produce is pretty similar, not much less than we used to produce when we had 70 million sheep. And it's quite a stunning story. The productivity improvement in our sheep industry has been, since 1990, when the things settled down after the changes, productivity improvement has been 170%, which is, if every other industry in New Zealand had done that, we'd be a wealthy country.
Agriculture is still a major part of New Zealand's economy, accounting for around 70% of goods exports. But it remains largely unsubsidized, and its farmers wouldn't have it any other way.
We're not getting any assistance from other than what we generate on farm to mitigate emissions, etc. And that, everything we do is a plus for the environment. And the fact, you put fertiliser, you build up the organic matter in the land. Pretty cool when you see other farming systems around the world how reliant on grain and subsidies.
So could the New Zealand model be applied elsewhere? We spoke with farmers in Iowa last summer about the role of subsidies in their work.
Biggest thing, I guess for me as a farmer is I want to make sure we have markets. I don't want direct payments. I would rather not have direct payments from the government. If we can have markets that will buy the grain and stuff from us, not have to depend on the government and develop those markets.
We don't want to rely on government payments. That's the last thing that we want to do. We've worked to try to eliminate that, and we want to try to create demand through domestic markets, through exports, to offset that.
It's easy to think about a world where farmers don't rely on direct payments from the government, where we create products for the market instead of creating markets for the products, where we encourage innovation through competition. Dan Glickman says that what might be thinkable as a matter of economics may well be unthinkable as a matter of politics.
Every senator has a large amounts of farm country and farm products and farmers, and they're a huge part of their constituency, and they have equal power. So the senator from North Dakota has equal power to the senator in California. That's the dominant factor. Then you have other factors, like the fact that Iowa has been the first caucus in the country historically. That's changing. But Iowa is, people go there and they talk about corn. Even Bernie Sanders talks about corn subsidies and doesn't really rail against them. And it doesn't matter what your political party you're in, Republican or Democrat, liberal or conservative. For the most part, everybody kind of talks about markets working, but it looks like we're going to have subsidies of some sort forever.
Coming up, self-driving taxis. Elon Musk promised they'd be here 5 years ago. Are they finally going to arrive this year? This is a story about overpromising and underdelivering. We've heard about robotaxis coming our way for 5 years now, and they're always just around the corner. But are they really coming? And when will they get here? Our colleague Ed Ludlow tells us the tale.
Is 2026 the year of the robotaxi?
I would say 2026 is the year of the Zoox robotaxi.
I think it's going to be in 2026 where this really starts to take off.
If I just zoom out, today in 2026, most of the autonomous activity in the world is happening in China and in a handful of cities in the US.
You're here.
It's the buzziest topic in Silicon Valley, and the public is going crazy for it.
It's a new experience. I'm looking forward to it.
But enthusiasm alone isn't enough to get us to a robotaxi world. 6 years ago, Elon Musk confidently predicted he'd have 1 million self-driving Teslas on the road by 2020. One of many predictions that proved to be too optimistic. After hearing that robotaxis are here for several years in a row, we're told 2026 will be the year of the robotaxi. The number of vehicles on the road is set to more than double, to 18,000 this year, from 8,000 in 2025. For our purposes, a robotaxi means on-demand, point-to-point autonomous ride-hailing. It's dynamic and not fixed route.
We will continue to see a growth in autonomous taxis in 2026. It will not be a dramatic change.
Mark Fagan is a lecturer at Harvard University's Kennedy School. He also runs an autonomous vehicle lab.
This is not going to be a year in which we see 20 cities with 25 to 50% of ride-hail rides being in robotaxis. It's all coming, but I don't believe it is a hockey stick.
For a nascent industry and business without much of a track record, there are already many players. Waymo, owned by Google parent Alphabet, takes existing cars and retrofits them with its self-driving system. It also works with car makers on purpose-built robotaxis like its vehicle with Zeekr, even though it still has a steering wheel. Right now, Waymo is the only company running fully driverless paid robotaxi services in the US without a safety driver. And it does plan to make 2026 the year that it publicly launches across America, from San Diego to Washington, D.C. Tesla and Amazon-owned Zoox are also piloting their first driverless programs, while May Mobility and AV Ride have launched in cities with safety drivers at the wheel, and in some cases, there isn't even a wheel.
The Zoox vehicle is bi-directional. It has inward-facing seats and no driver controls, no steering wheel,
Correct.
no pedals. And that has been the plan from day one.
Our robotaxi has been on the road for about a year plus. We've learned a lot. We've been transporting ourselves and members of the public. We've been practicing the service, getting feedback, making adjustments. We've expanded our geofence a couple of times.
Aisha Evans is the CEO of Zoox. It designs and builds its own robotaxi from scratch, runs its own app, and wants to control everything end to end. Zoox plans to own, operate, maintain, and manage its entire fleet itself.
Why not do what others are doing and start by retrofitting consumer vehicles?
We kind of look at what happens at scale, right? And then you work backward from there. And we felt that, in a way, even though at the beginning it would be slower and more difficult, at scale, it's going to be easier and more ubiquitous and more consistent. And we are giving them the personalization, we're giving them the experience. And we felt that starting that way made more sense. And yeah, it's been more difficult. It's been slower, but we're seeing now with regular people using it that it was worth it. And we believe it will allow us to scale faster.
How much is this going to cost to scale the Zoox platform and offering to the visions you've just outlined, but also to sort of bring a return on everything that's already gone into this project?
It's going to cost a lot, no question about it. This is a capital-intensive endeavor, but I think the returns are going to surprise people.
Then there's Tesla. Its vision is a robotaxi service made up of three things: a purpose-built cybercab now entering production, used Teslas the company takes back and controls, and privately owned cars. In that last case, owners would let their Tesla go out and work as a robotaxi for the day, essentially renting out their car, like Airbnb on wheels. A lot of companies are investing a lot of money on making the dream of robotaxis become a reality in the near future. But for that to happen, at some point it has to be a business, and that means distributing the substantial capital costs across a lot of units. Sarfraz Moredia leads Uber's autonomous mobility team.
When you talk about the unit economics of autonomous vehicles, it's actually quite simple because you can start with the reality that everybody is losing money. If we were to price those rides, or any of our competitors were to price those rides sort of to break even, they really would not be competitive with, any other ride you would take on Uber. And what we expect is over time that cost will come down, not just for the vehicle, but for the compute. And so as that cost becomes more competitive, I think you'll see the unit economics improve, but that's going to take several years.
It's very capital intensive, and the capital comes in two forms. One is the development of the technology itself, the software code. Think about this. You and I have spent decades of learning how to drive. So we know when it's a rainy, miserable day in New York, you're going to be more cautious. All of that has to be coded into the software that's operating the vehicle. The other side of the capital investment is the more traditional kinds of capital you think about. You're going to need to get relatively high utilization of the vehicles in order to pay off that capital cost.
In other businesses, the leader of the pack is the one who makes the numbers work. Robotaxis can be different. Competitors work together to harness the parts of the operation they do well to try and get to scale.
I think it is a dating situation where, we're all kind of interested in each other because, look, think of the data that we have, right? We know about pickup and drop-off locations. We know how to get through into a gated community, for example.
David Risher is Lyft's CEO.
We know when people take rides every single day, in every single jurisdiction in the United States. On the other hand, the robotaxi companies know a lot about how to drive cars with no human driver. We don't know anything about that. So it's actually one of those really nice things where at this time, we're all trying to sort of date and learn from each other and figure out what the models are going to be going forward.
While robotaxi pioneers in the US hunt for scale and for partners, China's racing ahead, with Goldman Sachs projecting a fleet of 1.9 million robotaxis in operation there by 2035, accounting for 25% of all ride-hailing vehicles in the country.
If I just zoom out, today most of the autonomous activity in the world is happening in China and in a handful of cities in the US. In 2026, I think you're going to see that change because you'll see more cities in the US and you'll see what is nascent operations in the Middle East. A market like Abu Dhabi, where we, with one of our partners, offered the first fully driverless ride outside of the US and China in the last couple of weeks. There, they've been very supportive of bringing autonomous tech to their city and more broadly in the UAE.
Not all robotaxi companies are operating in the same way. Where Zoox wants to build its own ecosystem, rideshare companies like Uber and Lyft want to focus on what they do best: dispatching cars and managing fleets. In December, Uber entered a partnership with AV Ride, allowing riders to order a robotaxi through the Uber app.
Main cameras are located right around the rider.
Sergey Kilarov is AV Ride's chief commercial officer.
We intentionally decided to not to create like the own ride-hailing app and partner with existing players, and Uber is a perfect partner for that. I think riders will benefit from having Uber's hybrid model by combining the autonomous rides and human drivers on the service.
Robotaxis may finally be on the way, but when they get here, we shouldn't assume that they'll do away with human drivers, at least not entirely.
Every day, 3 million plus people open up their phones and choose to take a Lyft. Sometimes today they're in a human driving car 99.99% of the time, but over time, increasingly, that'll be in a machine-driven car. And that's great, right? On the other hand, when you want help with your luggage, or maybe you want someone to chat with at the end of the day, or maybe it's your grandmother and you want to make sure that someone actually walks her to the door at the end of the ride, that's when you're going to choose a human driver. So I think the two of them are going to complement each other really well.
Annoying glitches are one thing, but there have been much more serious problems with some robotaxis as they've gone into operation.
In 2023, there was a very unfortunate incident in San Francisco where a woman was hit by a conventional vehicle, was knocked under a Cruise autonomous vehicle. The irony of this is we probably lost 100 people in the United States to car-related fatalities. We don't like when technology kills people.
We need to demonstrate with our partners a superhuman safety record that's not just miles driven, but also that the rides are going to be safe in different use cases, that they're going to be able to address edge cases.
So maybe, truly, these robotaxis are about to arrive in a city near you. They're high-tech, they're all the rage, but it turns out...
I don't know what that means, but it's flying the situation.
Even if you take away a driver, you can't take away user error.
Hi, this is Aisha. I'm in a ride. Are we departing soon? What's the holdup? He's not buckled up. Oh, he is buckled up.
Maybe it can detect.
No,
that
I
he's
know
not.
that. Yeah, it can detect. Okay, thank you. I appreciate it. Yeah, no, I get it. Thank you. All right.
We try to game the system.
This thing is, okay, aha. Off we go.
It's amazing.
Up next, the thrill of summiting the highest peak in the world and making money doing it. This is a story about making and spending money at the top of the world, that is. For as long as there have been humans, we've pushed beyond the horizon. From the great explorers to learning to fly to landing on the moon, we strive to do what has never been done before, and then we do it again and again to the point where it becomes as much a status symbol as heroic accomplishment. Our colleague Michael McKee takes us to the very pinnacle of this phenomenon, to the top of Mount Everest.
Mount Everest has been conquered. Tenzing Norgay, the Sherpa, now called the Tiger of Tigers, and Edmund Hillary of New Zealand, who, like the leader of the expedition, is to be knighted.
At 29,000 feet, climbing Mount Everest has long been one of the pinnacles of human ambition. And in the decade since it was first conquered by Sir Edmund Hillary and Tenzing Norgay Sherpa in 1953, Everest has become something of a playground for the rich, with queues snaking down the summit during the peak climbing season in spring.
Climbing very high mountains, or even the highest Mount Everest, is expensive, so there's a natural limitation that not everyone can do this. The climbing permit alone from the government of China or Nepal costs like $15,000, so that's already a lot of money to climb one mountain. And then you need all this equipment, you need oxygen, you need guides, and yeah, it costs a lot to climb these mountains.
Lukas Furtenbach is an Austrian adventurer. His company runs tours that can cost as much as 200,000 euros. His latest pitch? Using xenon gas. The target market, investment bankers, CEOs, and billionaires. The cash-rich and time-poor.
One of the big problems of climbing Mount Everest is that it takes so long because your body needs time to adapt to the low oxygen of these high altitudes. And the idea was first that we move this process of adapting the body to these low oxygen levels from the mountain itself to your home with systems where we can simulate altitude. That was the first step that we started like 10 years ago. And with this, we could make the expedition duration, we could cut it down from 10 weeks to 3 weeks, but we aim to go even further. So we have been working on different technologies, how we can enhance the acclimatization process. And we ended up with a medical gas called xenon that has been used in medicine as an anesthetic gas for 75 years in Europe, but also in the US. It helps the body to deal with low oxygen environment, with an hypoxic environment. It increases your red blood cells, it protects your lungs and your brain. And these are all beneficial effects that would help you in high altitudes. So after this treatment, people fly to the mountain, they can helicopter into base camp, and then immediately start climbing. Before, it was about 10 weeks because you trek into base camp and then you start to do multiple rotations on the mountain to get your body used to it. And then after a period of, let's say, 7 or 8 weeks on the mountain in base camp, you finally start your 1 week summit push. So we could bring it down from 10 to 1 week.
I assume this opens up a whole new world of clientele who might not have 10 weeks.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. I started this company in 2014.
Furtenbach also hopes to capitalize on a growing shift from the ultra-rich to seek out adventure in their downtime. From submarines to space to Antarctica and Everest, in a world where travel is increasingly accessible, luxury could mean being different. Lauren Wilt is the U.S. CEO of Quintessentially, a luxury concierge service providing lifestyle support to its clients, including on travel.
It's interesting because as travel has become so much more globally accessible, which is an amazing thing for our industry, we are seeing much more intentional travel. So what that looks like for quintessentially might be a conservation trip to Africa where they are staying on a preserve. We love Singita properties. It could be a gorilla trek through Rwanda that has a real focus on giving back to the communities. So really taking it to the next level and hyper customization is what we are doing in the luxury market.
Back in Nepal, a country where tourism contributes about 7% of its GDP and about the same number of its jobs. That trend is playing out on Everest.
This is development that I personally could see starting after the pandemic.
What's a higher level of luxury and comfort? You said from base camp to the summit, it's the same mountain climb that you have to do no matter what.
It is still the same mountain, that is true, and it is still, even with a high level of luxury in base camp, for example, it is still something like winter camping. We can set up more comfortable tents, bigger tents, so you have more space, more personal space, more private room. We can set up a bed in base camp. People used to sleep on very thin mattresses with a sleeping bag. Now we can have beds, we can have heated tents, we can have a Western chef coming into base camp. We can serve good wine, we can have Italian coffee with a big Italian coffee machine.
And the Nepalese government is taking notice. Every year it hands out just a few hundred permits to climb Everest, and recently it hiked prices. Deepak Joshi is the CEO of the Nepal Tourism Board.
This is icon of Nepal. This is one of the probably the most pride activity every adventure lovers they want to do in their lifetime. It costs a lot. From last year onwards, the government has made one fee structure. Before that, there was $11,000 per climber. That used to be the kind of fee to climb Mount Everest. Now it is increased to $15,000 USD.
That's a small percentage of the 199,000 euros that Furtenbach Adventures' signature Everest expedition is priced at. But with increased prices come increased expectations.
We have to be very selective. So some of these people just have this idea that now you can buy Mount Everest in a one-week trip and you don't need to do any training for it, and it makes everything very easy. But it's still the same climb, so you still need to do the same training, maybe even more.
Is there an ethical problem with commodifying risk as an affordable adventure for the wealthy?
Yes, it bounces back to the responsibility of the one who is offering this product. So I see a very high responsibility on our side to keep everything what we offer safe, because ultimately the clients are paying us to keep them safe. So of course we can't offer any products that we don't think are 100% safe. The same goes for the xenon treatment. We couldn't do this if we wouldn't have the medical backing that this is 100% safe and only serves to increase safety on climbing. So I'm very confident that we take this responsibility very serious, and I think at the end it's also on us to tell the client if something goes too far. It's a full stop here.
How do the Sherpas feel about this?
The Sherpas that have been involved in this project, that have access to all the information, they absolutely love it, because for them it means less work for the same money.
Camp 2, this is Camp 2, 6,500 meters.
But the Sherpa we spoke to wasn't so sure.
Xenon gas is, I think that is, one time is okay, but even the continue is that's bad. They want to need to make a record.
From Everest Summit!
Summit! Everest Summit!
The Sherpa are an ethnic group with deep ties to the Himalayas, with many working as guides and providing influential support to Everest expeditions. Kami Rita Sherpa's 31 summits of Mount Everest are a world record and include guiding many wealthy clients to get their moment atop the world's highest peak. We met him at his home in Kathmandu.
Rich people, are they more difficult to work with?
Yes, a little bit difficult with the rich people.
Why is that, do you think?
I think they are about rich people, you know. They're thinking only money, you know. Without Sherpa, they can't do anything. So they need to the Sherpa in the mountain. Some people is thinking about his money only, you know. Sometimes they say, I have a lot of money, I need to like this in the mountain too, you know. This mountain has to not get to everything.
We can see all different kinds of personalities, but as you can expect, many of them are these type A personalities, high performers in their jobs. They can be difficult, but they can also be very good to work with. They have very different motives why they climbed Mount Everest. And it's always hard to explain someone who has not been climbing, who never had this wish of climbing Mount Everest, why you want to do this, why you put yourself in one of the most dangerous environments on this planet. Why would you do that? And then earning criticism for it because it is bad for environment. You leave all the trash on the mountain, people die up there. Why would you do this? And I think you can say whatever reasons people are looking into finding themselves, people are looking into going back to real adventure, finding a raw experience. And I think this is partly the truth for some people, but at the end, if we look at very raw and fundamental things that we do in life, we don't invest money to have the experience of making the planet better. We do it to make money. And we don't climb to find ourselves or to find an experience. I think we climb mountains, and especially that goes for Mount Everest, to be on the summit.
Be it Everest or another form of adventure travel, local economies will continue to devise ways to get what they feel is their fair share of the revenue. But the human pursuit to be first, to be fastest, or to go highest seems unlikely to ever go away. Just be prepared to pay for it.
Next, why our groceries may be more affordable than we realize. Americans are none too happy with the prices at the grocery store, but it turns out that it could be much worse, as we've gone from a concern over food security to an overabundance and prices the government is working to keep down. Dan Glickman was Secretary of Agriculture under President Clinton, and he takes us from the dark days of the Depression to the present day of plenty.
It basically grew out of the Depression. You may recall that in the 1930s, in the heart of the Depression, the real economic distress occurred in rural America and small towns, and farms were failing all over the place. And Franklin Roosevelt knew that he had to do something about that, or we could have a revolution out there in the heartland and in rural America. So out of that basically came our farm programs to ensure that farmers and ranchers would have some sort of stabilized source of income. So they would create political stability, because he did not want to see chaos in farm country.
They're huge, but they've grown over time. What is the reason that they have grown?
Farmers are conceivably in a much more vulnerable position than they were even back in the 30s, when the problem was simply that the prices were low and they had the drought and the Dust Bowl to deal with it. And so they've grown considerably. I mean, probably 50 times we're spending now than we spent in the 1930s. But of course, we produce a lot more of everything from corn and soybeans and wheat, cotton and rice, and the row crops and the perishable crops. And we have to export a lot of them. It's a complicated business, and it's also related to the food industry. The food industry is a huge part of the American economy, and they all relate to each other.
As you say, we export an awful lot of what we grow in the United States, which suggests we've got more capacity than we need just for our own domestic consumption. So have we gone well past the point of food security? There was a time people were concerned about food security. We have no problem with that, do we?
No, we don't have famine in America. We have hungry people, and largely that's a problem of poverty and people not having enough money to, let's say, buy food, buy nutritious food, and do housing and energy and the other kinds of things. But thank goodness that we don't have the kind of famine that We did have back in the 30s, but we do produce more than we consume. It's just the nature of the beast. And most of that has to go overseas. And if there is a thing that cuts off our ability to sell overseas, like a tariff out of the blue coming from the sky, it really does impact the economics of agriculture.
Before you were Secretary of Agriculture, you served in the Congress from Kansas. So you've seen the politics of this from both ends of Pennsylvania Avenue, as it were. What are the politics? What is driving it politically in Washington?
Well, it's interesting. The heartland states, kind of from North Dakota south to Texas, and then surrounding states, each have 2 senators. And so North Dakota has 2 senators with 650,000 people, and California has 2 senators with 50 million people. And North Dakota is a pure agricultural state. I only use them as an example. So what's driving it are the politics of rural America. They're very significant, particularly with respect to the United States Senate. In the House of Representatives, there are probably less than 20% of the members, maybe 25%, that come from farm or rural districts. But in the Senate, every senator has large amounts of farm country and farm products and farmers, and they're a huge part of their constituency, and they have equal power. So the senator from North Dakota has equal power to the senator in California. That's the dominant factor. Then you have other factors, like the fact that Iowa has been the first caucus in the country historically. That's changing. But Iowa is, people go there and they talk about corn. Even Bernie Sanders talks about corn subsidies and doesn't really rail against them. And now you have ethanol, which is, of course, alcohol fuels which come from corn. And that's become a big issue as well. So you have a combination of those factors that make it so that agriculture is a big part of American politics.
If we can't eliminate them, could we make them better?
Yes, and we've tried to do that. We created a program called crop insurance. It's a risk management program where you can buy insurance and the government subsidizes those insurance premiums. It's the biggest part of our farm programs right now, especially with the big row crops in the heartland in the Midwest and the South. And with those premiums, you can insure against price volatility, you can insure against weather volatility, and it was the way we thought we were going to go to ultimately eliminate just the direct payments out there. But it doesn't seem to solve the problem entirely, because what you end up with, these crises that happen, the tariffs come about, or some massive natural disaster, and then Congress comes in by and large, and then they want additional relief. And you know, I'm not sure that farmers really like that, because this is billions and billions of taxpayer dollars that continue. But on the other hand, a lot of folks really need this, or they will go under, particularly smaller producers and diversified farmers.
There's a perception for those of us who are not farmers to think, oh, the farmers are sort of on the dole, it's a good thing for them. But when you talk to a lot of farmers, particularly the row crop farmers, they say they'd rather do without them. They would rather make their money by producing their crops and selling them domestically and overseas.
And I think they would. And I think that a lot of farmers, particularly larger farmers who are diversified, that produce more than one crop, not monocrop agriculture, and have livestock, which is doing quite well right now, a lot of them kind of can get along without the subsidies. But there are an awful lot of farmers that can't. And so this is always the conflict in there. And then you have the politics of it. Let's look at the current situation. President Trump has deep support in rural America and farm country.
So we saw just what you described in the first Trump administration, where there were issues with China and soybeans, and there was a substantial farm bill, as I recall, giving some short-term assistance to farmers. And then we have it coming back again in the second Trump administration, and now there's a proposal for another $12 billion, I think is the proposal right now, to try to help the farmers out. Is that enough to take care of the problem?
Well, it'll help, but it's not going to ultimately take care of the problem, because not all the right farmers are getting the assistance. So far, the fruit and vegetable and the non-row crop farmers aren't in the program, although they may get assistance as time goes on. These subsidies, these special subsidies, don't really take into account the differences between the crops, because if you help corn or soybeans, you may not be helping wheat or cotton at the same time, and you skew the economic formulas that are there. It's not a perfect system by any stretch of the imagination, but some folks really need it, or they'll go under without these payments. But there are a lot of folks that don't need it at all. That's the irony of the whole thing.
We think of farm subsidies as affecting the farmers, which they certainly do. But as you suggest, there's an entire food system. I mean, there are people involved in processing the food, people involved in selling the food, grocery stores. There are people who ultimately consume the food, and including on food stamps or SNAP. So what are the other unintended consequences in the system from the subsidies?
Well, ironically, the subsidies kind of keep prices lower than what they would otherwise be. You know, the fact of the matter is the food price index, while it's volatile and some products like eggs and beef are certainly higher right now, ironically, the subsidies probably act as a lid on prices, because if you didn't have the subsidies, the marketplace would probably make food more expensive. And you see that with some other products there. Right now, you know, I'm watching all the discussion about food prices, and it's complicated because actually Americans have a real bargain in terms of the price of food that they get. You know, we're one of the lowest in the world in per capita in terms of how much we pay for food. But we also still have a lot of poor people who, because of poverty, who can't afford the food, and that's where our programs like SNAP come into play.
That does it for us here at Wall Street Week. I'm David Weston. See you next week for more stories of capitalism.